My life at Withcote from May 1955 to September 1956, another quite short stay. There's not a great deal of national news that has a lasting effect upon a child of primary school age. A birthday party or holiday by the sea is far more likely to remain in the mind some 30 or 40 years later. In the 1950s, we didn't have television. We spent little time listening to the news on the wireless, though we did sometimes have a daily paper. I remember Winston Churchill had completed his last day as Prime Minister, but all that I knew of this man, he'd been a hero as a leader of our country during the war years. He had a typical V sign, and he normally was photographed with a cigar in his mouth. In reality, there was little that the government did that really affected my daily routine, especially during the long school holidays. I remember my parents talking about the name of Ruth Ellis, but I think it was about 6 years later before the name cropped up again, this time in a debate at a school relating to capital punishment. It was actually only then that I learned that she had been the last woman to be hanged in this country. It was an interesting time to be growing up, and looking back over old newspaper cuttings gives an idea of how some things never change. There were sightings of the Loch Ness Monster being reported in Inverness by holidaymakers, but the story gained much credence when it was supported by the word of a local farmer, clearly a more reliable source than tourists or journalists. Events today in the House of Commons suggest that some things have not really changed, even though we have entered the next millennium. In 1955, it was a rule that stopped free discussion on the radio and television of topics due to be debated in Parliament. Democracy and the right to free speech seemed to cause much conflict for those we supposedly elected to uphold them. The new millennium began with a government that seemed almost hysterical that the public be allowed to protest in any way against its policies, and it threw privacy on the refuse tip by declaring its right to open and read emails, even to have an elite branch of the police for this purpose. Anyway, I digress there. In May, we had left Bishop's Castle once more, following the death of Mrs. Lowther. At that time, I had no idea that I was to return to Hollybush again and spend some of the happiest years of my youth there. Withcote was in Leicestershire, though the postal address placed it in Rutland, the smallest county in England. That was all we knew. Rutland was flat, very flat. We soon gathered that on our arrival. We soon learned it was also very cold in the winter, with easterly winds that swept in, having come across the North Sea. Our time there was short, little more than a year, but was to be a very happy period as far as I was concerned. I came to love the farm and the area around it as one of the best for any young child to grow up. There were opportunities galore for fantasy and for adventure. The farm was the part of the estate of Withcote Hall and had a herd of milking cattle. We lived in a small cottage whose back door opened onto the yard for the cattle and the dairy, and whose front door led to a small garden that had a lawn and a border of good old orange Old English marigolds. The yard consisted of the milking parlour on one side, our cottage and a wall on another. Facing the cottage across the yard was a large stone barn with great doors on both sides, and then the square was completed by a series of small sheds in which calves were reared. The yard was covered in concrete, and we used it for roller skating when it was not covered with such hazards as cow muck. Looking at the structure of the barn, I can imagine that it might have had some heritage value, though such things were of little importance in those days when many old country estates were quite literally falling apart. Beyond the garden was an enormous field that consisted of a series of long ridges. These puzzled me for a while until I learned they were the remains of a medieval farming pattern where families would farm the strips of land. It was no longer ploughed and served as grazing land for both cattle and sheep. The original strips might well have been the length of a furrow long, or a furlong of 220 yards. I cannot recall too much about the house that we lived in, except that the kitchen and bathroom were both quite large. There was a hot and cold water supply for the house, but the cold water was not suitable for drinking. To obtain water for that purpose, we had to take a large container to the stable yard and use a water pump. A few strokes of the handle, much groaning from the rather worn contraption, and eventually water would come gushing from the spout. Whilst we were there, one of the land girls, I think it was Vera, let us borrow a record player, together with a few old records. The player was old enough to need the needles changing every few records and still emitted its sound via a trumpet-shaped cone. It looked as if it might have been the original for the logo of the company His Master's Voice, which had a small white dog sat listening to a record player. The only record I do recall playing several times was a version of As She Walked the Bloody Tower, with the line, "With her head tucked underneath her arm." I guess that the lyric referred to Tudor times, when the Tower was a favoured place for executions. I think that the artist who recorded it was Stanley Holloway. On Saturday mornings we would listen to a programme called Children's Favourites, which was hosted by a number of personalities of the day, my favourite being Uncle Mac. The numbers that I remember from those days included Frankie Vaughan singing Green Door, one with the line 20 tiny fingers, 20 tiny toes. There was also a Rosemary Clooney number, There's a Railroad Running Through the Middle of the House. Sunday lunchtimes had Forces Family Favourites. This was a request programme for servicemen and women based overseas, and many of the numbers had survived in popularity since the days of the war. Vera Lynn was still going strong with her wartime hits. The owners of the estate, the Kavanagh family, lived in the grandeur of Withcote Hall. The front of the hall overlooked a large ornamental garden that led down to a lake. To the side of the hall was another expansive lawn and a path that led to a small chapel. The chapel, like the hall, is now protected by being a listed building on the English Heritage List. The original building is believed to have been started during the 14th century, but the present building dates to the 16th century. We were encouraged to attend the Sunday school here every Sunday afternoon. For our pains, we were given a small booklet in which pictures could be stuck. The pictures of the biblical characters or biblical scenes were issued only to those who attended the services on the Sunday afternoons. I was not over-impressed, already having some idea about the events that occurred so many years ago, and doubted that the pictures were true representations, and wondered why they seemed all to be dressed in Victorian clothing. However, it seemed wise not to question too much at that time. I did wonder whether the stamps also served another purpose. Since if your card was missing a stamp, and your parents knew that you had skipped Sunday school on that afternoon. There was a glorious brass lectern, the eagle with its wings spread. From time to time we were asked to read from the lectern, and I did enjoy this very much. There was, I presumed, a service in the mornings to which the others went, though I do know that neither of my parents attended, and neither did Vera and Liz, the land girls. The part of the house that looked across to the church was possibly the original main entrance to the house. There was a driveway which led from the road to Oakham. It was a truly magnificent driveway, probably about a third of a mile long, and lined on either side by great horse chestnut trees. Oh, the autumn was a paradise for collecting and playing the rather English game of conkers. A lovely rectangular stable yard had survived, almost intact. There was a great love of horses from the family, and a groom was employed. His working office was on one side, together with the stables that had survived. His office or workplace was always full of tackle, and it smelt very strongly of saddle soap. Many of the other buildings had been converted into grain stores, and a complex series of ducts and pipes led into the lofts from a grain dryer, quite an innovation at that time. One side of the stable yard consisted of an arched opening, with a clock on the tower above the arch. The furthest part of the yard consisted of a shed that housed the pump for the fresh water, an open shed where the farm van was kept, a Bradford Javelin, a garage where Mike Kavanagh kept his car, Black Triumph Mayflower, There were a few other storage sheds, and above these a flat where one of the servants to the family lived, a Mrs. Mason. I came to know her son, another David, though I think my parents were always a little unhappy about the friendship. However, living in the country, you usually made friends with whoever lived nearest, and saw very little of those of your own age. Beyond the stable yard was a large walled garden, which not only enclosed a large area for growing vegetables and bringing on plants, but also had a separate cottage for a gardener. There was a sunken greenhouse and potting shed in the garden, and I used to enjoy being asked if I wanted to go and help with potting up of plants. The garden cottage also became a place where we contrived to go during the second summer of our stay there. They had bought a television, and although the reception was not too good, it was a real novelty for us. I had seen a television when I had visited relatives who lived in Nottingham, but we never owned one, and this was the first farm we had been where there was one. The only thing of note that I do remember watching was Peter Loader playing cricket for England and taking a hat-trick. This was more by good luck and accident than by design, since my father had spent about 20 minutes with the gardener, one on top of the ladder, the other in the sitting room in front of the television, both trying to find a position for the aerial that gave the best signal. Late in the summer, Lady Kavanagh tried to encourage me to do some gardening on my own, and she gave me a small patch of border that had been left during the warmer months and was now overgrown with weeds. And my enthusiasm got as far as clearing all the weeds out, cultivating the soil, and planting flower seeds. Somehow the plot never got tended, and I must have lost interest. Wildflowers, birds, and animals were far more interesting. My enthusiasm for bird watching led to my leaving my glasses hanging in the trees somewhere in nearby woodland. We never did find the glasses. I don't think I was too popular with my parents over that loss. School was a bus journey into a small village called Nossington. Here was a brick building dating to Victorian times and very much a typical church-controlled primary school. The building consisted of two areas used as classrooms and a small area used as a staff room. Attached was a small cloakroom area. Outside the playground consisted of a small area of tarmac. There was no grass. On one wall had been painted some targets and a couple of wickets for playground cricket. My first day at the school was to be remembered by a confrontation with the school bully, determined to let a newcomer know exactly where they stood in the pecking order. Playground fighting was not something that I had a great deal of experience of dealing with, but I certainly had no intention of standing down. The morning break had already seen me witness this character depriving another of a snack that his mother had most likely made him. This sort of intimidation did not seem right to me. I declined to acknowledge him as the leader, or whatever he thought he was. So he hit me rather firmly in the stomach, and that seemed to be rather like lighting a touch paper inside me, so I proceeded to lay into him. By the time a teacher had arrived on the scene to put an end to the confrontation, I had suffered a few bruises, and my opponent had a face rather discoloured by his own blood. I was never troubled with bullying again at that school. Lessons at the school were clearly geared for a particular purpose. There were numerous tests, regular setting of short pieces of homework, a great emphasis on mathematics and English, particularly on spelling. All of this, as I learned during my year at the school, was a preparation for a series of official tests called the 11 Plus. This was the test taken at the end of the primary school, which was attended until the age of 11. After that, your future was determined in many counties by your performance in these tests. Those who achieved the highest scores went on to a grammar school. Such schools were supposed to provide for the education of the top 20% of pupils. And if you were not amongst those, then your future lay in attending a secondary modern school. I soon became aware that this particular village was able to send far more than 20% of its pupils onto the grammar school, its methods being geared solely to that purpose. I also realised that those who were deemed as having no chance of making the grade were often left very much to their own devices. Art lessons were few and far between. Craft lessons were simply not really on the curriculum. In fact, anything not concerned with the 11 plus was ignored as far as possible. One term we were supposed to draw a line of numbers along a piece of sugar paper and then produce a pattern and decorate them with painting. That it took almost 2 months to complete this exercise gives some idea of just how little time was devoted to art. Oakham was the county town for Rutland and the nearest town of any size for us. We were taken there on some Saturdays when my father was allowed to make use of the farm van, the Javelin. This remarkable little vehicle chugged away with a 2-cylinder engine and never seemed to let us down. The ride in the back, often sitting on a couple of old cushions, was not the most comfortable in the world. However, it did provide us with our outing for the week. This we parked near the rail station and walked into town from there. There was really only one street to the town that had shops and also the cinema. However, it was larger than Bishop's Castle and so seemed pretty good to my sisters and I. There was a bus service into the town on Saturday, and my parents eventually decided that we could be trusted to go into the town on our own, though actually usually with the Gray family who lived on the next farm. These outings usually consisted of much gazing in the shop windows, spending a few pence pocket money, and that could take a whole afternoon. On other occasions we were given money to go to the cinema, which we regarded as a real treat. For a while I actually saved little money, due to a relative sending me a postal order and my parents suggesting that I started a book on national savings stamps. I filled the book, then I immediately blew the lot on a fishing rod. The journey to Oakham took us through a small village called Braunston, the only other village of any size besides Nossington. Further away was the town of Melton Mowbray, famous for its production of pork pies. However, we rarely seemed to visit the town. It was many years later before I actually drove through and stopped to have a look around. There was a bustling market in evidence on that day. One of the attraction features of the estate was the ornamental lake that had been constructed by the Hall by damming off a stream. It was very well stocked with fish, and at weekends a number of fishermen would arrive and they would pay their sixpences to be able to fish for the afternoon. We had not been there before long before I persuaded my parents to let me spend my savings on a small rod and line and go fishing at the lake, an activity we were allowed to do without having to pay sixpence a time. At first it was a great novelty, the first bite of the day, then seeing how big we could manage to catch a fish, then how many. After a while the novelty kind of wore off a little, the lake being so well stocked it was almost impossible not to catch a fish. At the end of the lake was a boathouse with a thatched roof. There were no longer any boats kept for the lake, although it was very easy to imagine it must have been a lovely way to relax on a summer afternoon, drifting on the lake under the sun. We had a small den that we looked after and guarded jealously, which was situated on the thatch of the boathouse. About half a mile away from the main farm buildings there was what appeared at first to be a large barn. In spring it served as a shelter for ewes during the lambing season, but for the rest of the years it seemed to serve as an indoor riding school. There was little doubt from the number of horses kept on the large estates that this was hunting country, although we saw very little of the hunt's activities on the farm itself. Lambing time was an important occasion. We used to delight in helping with any lambs that had lost their mother by bottle feeding them with milk from the dairy. Sadly, there were a number of these since there was a copper deficiency in the soil in the area, and this led to pregnancy problems for the ewes. Some of the lambs also suffered, with the result they were called swaybacks, having difficulty in standing up. The solution was to buy large blocks that were primarily salt but also contained other minerals, and these would make up for the deficiencies. The farm employed my father as the herdsman, tractor driver, and 2 land girls, Vera, known as Cocky, and Liz Chater for the 2 land girls. They were very nice, and I came away with lovely memories of both of them. Liz, I believe, came from a wealthy family in Yorkshire, and she ran a Ford Popular car. I do remember helping her out during the harvest, and for a reward she decided to take me to the cinema in Oakham as my treat. I think it was to watch Davy Crockett or some similar film. The outing was actually a rather strange affair, since in the cinema she put her arm around me in a sort of maternal sort of way. I liked helping Liz, and often she would let me come to where she and Vera lived, and I could get various goodies such as sweets from her. The land girls lived in a bungalow at the bottom of the drive. The garden was always kept very neat and tidy. Occasionally we might get to play in their garden. Harvest time on the farm was a busy and exciting time, offering lots of opportunities for getting involved in simple tasks. Large acreage was given over to the growing of cereals, the farm having a silver-coloured combine made by glass. It seemed to consist of many aluminum panels. I was told that the machine was made in Germany and that much of the material for the bodywork had come from materials originally intended for use on planes. Whether true or not, I've never managed to ascertain, but I do remember it was not self-propelled and needed to be pulled by a tractor. It certainly had massive wheels with smooth tyres that looked as if they would have been more at home as part of the landing gear of an aeroplane. Harvesting involved 3 stages at Withcote. Very early on in the summer, grass was cut and stored green as silage. To keep it in a palatable condition, molasses was added to stimulate fermentation. The molasses was purchased in large barrels and then diluted with water. My task was to ensure this solution was then spread over the silage in the pit, making use of the watering can with a large nose. Later on, haymaking became important. The hay was collected in loose during the first year and ricks built. Alternative crops were being tried out in those days, and we had 2 fields of alfalfa or lucerne grown. This was a leguminous crop, and the theory was that it would return nitrogen to the soil. The grain crop was far more interesting. This was when the combine harvester was brought out, cleaned and oiled, ready for the season. Most of the cereal grown was wheat. Change to barley had not yet taken place on most farms. We used to lend a hand by working on the combine, which did not have a tank to hold the grain. So the task was to ensure that new sacks were fitted as the grain was threshed inside the combine and to tie up those bags that were full. The sacks were then taken away to be emptied into the hopper leading to the grain dryer. The third harvest took place much later, the lifting of root crops for cattle fed during the winter months. The crop in this case was mangolds. A small machine was used for cutting these up, the device being called a mangle wurzel. But we fed the lot as it was. The mangles were stored in the old barn as one enormous pile. The summer highlight during 1956 was to be taken to Oakham Show. It was not the various military-type stunts that held any particular imagination for me. What was really fascinating was the number of horse and carriage outfits that were paraded. Carriages seemed to have been freshly painted, possibly even lacquered, and anything metal had been polished until it gleamed. There were also shire horses, complete with their harness and other regalia, some drawing carts, whilst others were just being paraded. Tractors seemed largely intrusive on this magnificent sight. Premium bonds were being sold during that summer. At that time, the minimum investment that was needed was £1, and the prize was £1,500, with numerous smaller prizes down to £25. Today, all that's been replaced by a national lottery, with prizes running into the millions. I believe that we have been led down a path of greed. The idea that for the same stake now there's a chance of getting several £1,000,000 has its appeal in being placed in a position where one need not have to worry about many things. This is at a time when poverty, even in the United Kingdom, is on the increase. Other events over that summer were not ones that can be recalled with any fondness. The country lurching towards a confrontation with Egypt over the Suez Canal and continuing to have nuclear testing. Typically, the government were giving out assurances that a shelter with 3 feet of earth over was going to be adequate protection from the blast and radiation. At some point during the second summer, I became involved in a silly fight, a dispute that was actually between David Mason and the Grey Boys. It was a little difficult because I was actually friends with both, but I suppose that foolish idea of loyalty to the idea that David Mason and I were both from the same farm prevailed. For my part in the fight, I did actually get a good thrashing from my father. The farm owned a bull, hardly surprising with a milking herd of cattle. The animal was to leave an impression on me that has lasted. The animal was usually tethered when out at pasture, using a long chain linked to a ring in its nose, which sounds cruel, and I've no doubt it was. On one occasion it broke loose when being moved and trapped Vera in a yard. She was terrified. My father went to her aid and also received something of a kicking and mauling, including losing many of his teeth. I watched this take place from the not very safe vantage of our garden, with only a wooden fence to separate me from the animal. The bull was destroyed shortly afterwards. There were some happier times during that second summer. Playing in the open barn among piles of hay and bales of straw was enjoyable. The Grey girls had discovered that they were growing up, and that led to some interesting games that would have shocked our parents had they discovered anything of our antics. Social workers would have probably wondered if we should have all been put into care. Sandra and Una were exploring their own sexuality, and I and another boy were the subjects of their experimentation. How innocent it all seemed to be as we explored each other's bodies. The idea involved chasing each other over the hay and straw in the larger barns, and then, when caught, you could then explore the other's body. Sandra made it very clear I was to catch her each time, because she didn't like the other boy who was playing. I guess that I had reached an age when hormones were starting to kick in, but I admit that being cuddled by Liz Chater was just as attractive at that time, although being explored by Sandra and being allowed to put my hand down her panties at the time was quite interesting, and she certainly managed to arouse me. My time at Nossington Primary School ended with the news that I had passed 11 plus tests. It seemed to cause much joy to my parents, though I still felt the whole thing was no big deal, being unaware of the limitations offered by secondary modern schools at the time. At the end of the summer, I began my secondary education by attending the grammar school in Melton Mowbray. I actually attended the school for less than a month before we moved, so I have no real recollection of life there. We had to travel by bus, quite a long journey of around 10 miles, so we found ourselves waiting at the end of the drive at about 8 each morning. In spite of the cold winds in winter that seemed to cut through any item of clothing, it was a place I do remember with some affection. And in some ways, I was a little disappointed when it was announced that we were to move over to another farm on the Welsh borders.